We happen to have a very special guest who is going to help me moderate this panel. So Suzie Dunn has been studying deepfakes as a PhD student at the University of Ottawa. And we sort of just realized that you, of course, had to be here.
Absolutely.
So literally driving from Ottawa yesterday.
Yeah. Found out on Thursday, drove down.
Yes.
Through a polar vortex.
Oh my golly, thank you so much. We are so honored. So Susie's going to help me moderate this panel. And we have privacy rock stars with us today. I feel like I got to introduce some of you right during your questions. I'm so annoying, I know. So Marianne Franks from the University of Miami, professor of law, president, and legislative director of the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative. And Marianne's tired of me going on and on about her, but too bad, so sad. You are a change maker, and we love you. And her new book, The Cult of the Constitution, comes out in May. So everyone buy it. I pre-ordered 2 copies. Everyone needs to pre-order. Thank you very much. Okay. And next to Marianne is Professor Ari Waldman from New York Law School, who, like Marianne and I, we have written a lot about online harassment in the LGBTQ community. And Ari has been doing wonderful work on privacy law and design. So thank you for joining us to talk about, and you do not have to talk about design, though I get very excited when you do, and engineering. And again, here we go. We have our Northeastern rock stars on this side of the table. Woody Harzig, who is professor of law and professor of computer science at Northeastern University. His book, Privacy's Blueprint, lays such important groundwork. I feel like I see it everywhere. Is it nominated for Book of the Year by IAPP? Oh, it is, FYI. Okay, so whoops, letting the cat out of the bag. But it's such an important book we all need to read to understand how to design technologies so that they're privacy protective and have a conversation that isn't just limited to engineers and lawyers, but policymakers altogether. So next to Woody is Jessica Silbey, also from Northeastern, professor of law, who's a Guggenheim Fellow. Is that over yet? So fancy. It's very exciting. And Jess has done incredible work on intellectual property and the importance of photographic evidence and images. So I'm so excited that we're all here together to talk. So I'm going to let you all take over. And Suzie and I are going to help facilitate really just conversations amongst you guys and then questions. Okay, I'll be fine. I'm so
Thank you very much, Danielle, and thank you to the University of Maryland Law Review, and thanks to everyone for being here. It's really exciting for me to talk about this topic, not only because deepfakes are scary and terrible, and who doesn't like talking about scary and terrible things out there, but also Danielle and Bobby's article made me think about material or issues that I've been thinking about before, but in a new way. So I thought that I would spend some time, spend a few minutes talking about the implications of deepfake videos for the queer community. And when I say queer community, I use that as a general term for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender individuals, although Q is one of the letters in LGBTQ, and some people identify as queer who don't identify as lesbian or gay and everything else. I'm just going to use it to make it easy on us as an umbrella term for everyone. And I wrote up this very quick presentation that kind of achieves one unrelated goal to deepfakes is that I think academic presentations need to be far more minimal. So hopefully there will be just a cue of something on the presentation, and then you'll spend the rest of the time just looking at me. So So I want to talk about, so I want to start this discussion with a focus on queer dating, and with a story that we know about that doesn't have, that many of us know about, that doesn't have anything to do with deepfake specifically, but is a good starting off point for talking about queer dating and the implications for the queer community of deepfake videos. So as some of you may know, there is a case winding its way through the courts right now, which is being litigated by a colleague and a friend of some of us on the panel, Carey in New York, about a man who was a Grindr user. Grindr is kind of Tinder for gay and bisexual men, and it's a geolocation app that people use to identify other potential romantic partners. And as a result of a breakup, or as a result of a nasty breakup, an ex of this man who had photos of him on his phone, created a fake Grindr profile, and over the course of 6 months, sent about 1,100 different men to his home or his place of business looking for sex. And so this is a revenge porn, doxing, and catfishing story that brings up a whole series of questions about significant effects on gay people who tend to use dating platforms at far higher rates than people who prefer opposite sex relationships, but also platform responsibilities. Grindr refused to do anything about these fake profiles because, and as they specifically and very obviously said, they didn't have to. Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act completely immunizes them from all liability and said, well, we're not gonna do anything about these fake profiles, and we're not gonna even respond to your complaints because this is not part of our business. So I wanted to use this as a jumping off point to think about what might be the implications for queer people who are using geosocial dating apps if deepfake videos and fake photos become the norm. And we can talk about how the law leaves our institutions kind of laid bare. And what I mean by institutions, I mean, in this case, the social institution of dating. The development of technologies that allow dating to move from, saying, meeting someone at a bar, meeting someone on an elevator, to meeting someone over an app, even when you're at the bar, has made dating and social interaction far more transactional and far more physical. And what I mean by that is transactional when I say dating is transactional, it's the idea that you click on someone or you send them a message and you say, do you want, and I think a euphemistic way of saying it these days is Netflix and chill, ? Or you up, or something like that, and then you have an intimate connection, intimate small I, not necessarily intimate, but certainly sexual. So it's made it very transactional. You click on something, someone comes over to your house, you have sex, and you move on. It's made it also more physical in that dating platforms are based on pictures. That's the first and sometimes only thing that you see when you decide if you're going to swipe left or right on someone. You don't see a story about them. You don't see an about me. You just see a picture. And sometimes those pictures are maybe not of the actual person that you're going to hook up with or date, and maybe it was of that person, but it was taken 20 years ago. So technology has made dating far more transactional and far more based merely on the physical. In queer communities, which tend to use dating platforms and dating apps at far higher rates than people in opposite sex relationships for several reasons. One, because it's harder, depending upon where you live, it's harder to meet people in the physical world. And also because these were among the first and most popular apps. So they have become much more popular within the community. And once an app reaches a tipping point, everyone feels, despite what might be opposition, everyone feels like they have to join. And that phenomenon, that kind of herding effect phenomenon, has been proven far more powerful in the gay community, particularly among gay and bisexual men, than elsewhere. So you have relationships that are now transactional. You have sex, which finding sex has become far more, or finding relationships become far more physical. And then you pile that on top of a community, particularly gay and bisexual men, that emphasize the physical far more, and you have kind of a perfect storm of victimization, or perfect storm for potential for victimization. And the Grindr case is one example. So what would happen? What would happen if fake videos and fake images that portray people in intimate situations become the norm on these platforms? So I've done some research on how these platforms interact with their users, and many of them allow revenge porn and other forms of racism and sexism and hate to proliferate on their platforms because they have no legal obligation to do anything else. And they believe that their goal is to protect the free speech rights and other rights of their users, as opposed to ensure that people are safe. In a world where the truth of what you see and the trust that you have in other people on the platform is completely eroded, because again, dating platforms are all based on what you see. They're only based on images and videos. And they're all based on trust that you have in other people on the platform. Because if anyone has ever used these platforms, you share very intimate, private, potentially harmful information, if it got out, harmful information with these other people. You share with them your sexual secrets. You share with them your sexual preferences, whether you're an assertive partner, a receptive partner, whether you're a dominant personality, a submissive personality. You share with them your wants, your desires. These are the kind of things that people only share, as I found in my research, with some sense of trust that everyone else on the community, everyone else on the app is also out for the same thing. But when law doesn't exist to support or buttress those norms of trust, then everything breaks down. And that's what deepfakes do. So when you go on a platform that queer people tend to use more often and tend to rely on for intimate connection and tend to rely on trust norms that they develop organically from the platform, and when you throw in the potential for lying and fake videos and fake images, then you wonder, well, what's left? Then there becomes no opportunity for anyone to feel safe on these platforms. And as soon as people don't feel safe, they're either not going to use them, which is going to create loneliness, depression, inability to connect to your own community. And it's also going to erode the tools, the only tools that queer people feel that they have in 2019 in order to meet other queer people. And that's even true in a city like Baltimore or New York City, where there are tons of other queer people around, but it's simply hard to meet. So my thoughts, and I'm interested to hear what other people feel about this, my initial thoughts when it comes to thinking about the effect that deepfakes have on the queer community, in particular queer dating, is that the erosion of trust norms on these platforms takes away what little power we still have over our social and romantic lives. Because the power that we exert on these platforms is the power to be sex positive, the power to share and find other people who can benefit and make us feel happier and make us feel belong to a part of a community. And when you can't trust the other people, and you can't trust what you see on the platform, then we lose that control. And that can contribute to feelings of hopelessness and complete loss and detachment from the central identity that you have, to the central identity of who you are. And I think that could be really harmful. That could lead to, not just as a personal level, to feelings of suicidal ideation, but it could also create detachment from who you are. Imagine being a gay person and feeling no connection to the gay community because you can't join in the tools that the gay community uses to meet each other or to engage with one another. And if any of us have had personal experiences with trying to be a part of a community and then losing the power over defining themselves in that community, then you feel completely lost and completely aimless. And that's particularly harmful for younger people and for people who are vulnerable to pressures from other people. So I think this could probably be the worst of everything for, especially for a community that's already facing great burdens. So thanks on that.
Well, it's technically called the upside of deepfakes, and so I feel like maybe. First of all, thank you so much to the Maryland Law Review. Thank you to Meredith and everyone on the staff who's been phenomenal. This has been a phenomenal event so far, and I can't wait for the rest of the day. Thanks to Danielle for helping bring us all together here. This talk came out of, as so many wonderful things in life, inspired by something that Danielle said when she came to Northeastern to give a talk about deepfakes. And I got to thinking about this sort of point, this larger point, and decided that it might be worth at least sussing it out in this presentation and in this article. And Jessica has been so kind to join me in this because she's thought really deeply about a lot of these issues, and so we're going to do a little two-parter where I'm going to get up and do the easy part and say the uninteresting things, and then Jessica's going to actually come in and I think talk deeply more about what we mean. Okay, so first of all, we want to say it's bad. We know it's bad. We know it's actually abjectly horrible, and the more you think about it, sort of the worse down that hole it becomes, right? And so you think about, oh man, this could be bad in several different ways. But that being said, we'd like to make 3 points saying that there actually might be some upsides here. And we wanted to explore what some of that was. So we want to make 3 points here. Yes, deepfakes are a privacy train wreck. But the argument that we want to make is that actually a lot of what we fear about deepfakes are not necessarily the harm unique to deepfakes, but rather symptoms of larger problems. With that being in mind, there's an advantage built in. Because deepfakes are so visceral, because they are so easy to imagine as we sort of start to think about, like, oh, this could be bad, we had such incredible imagery presented by Danielle that this actually is something that frightens us, and we can use that fear. I think, and Jessica and I are going to argue that deepfakes present an opportunity to leverage the visceral, powerful nature of deepfakes, not for small prophylactic changes, but rather deep structural reforms that we've all agreed were a good idea for a long time, but we've never had the impetus to politically push forward. Deepfakes could be the thing that we needed, right? The one push to get us over several different hills. And so we say, let's use that, right? Let's use the sort of visceral nature of deepfakes for a greater structural good. And it's not just about privacy. There are, and this is what Jessica's going to talk about, it might be the impetus for broad civic institutional reform because deepfakes present such a unique and vivid challenge. Okay, so first, deepfakes are a symptom of several different problems. One of the things that, as I listened to Danielle speak, about the harms of deepfakes, both at Northeastern and even here today, I began to realize that a lot of the reason why deepfakes are so problematic is because they stand to wreak havoc on already vulnerable infrastructures and institutions. There are a number of things that have been crumbling for quite some time now, and deepfakes merely sort of comes in and supercharges that. And so what are some of the things? Privacy. Deepfakes do present a privacy problem, but a lot of it is not necessarily an entirely unique privacy problem. The fact that we have the ability to easily and at almost no cost or liability host or disseminate all kinds of information is something that we've been wrestling with for years, right? The debate over Section 230 is also a representation of the sort of larger problem about who is held liable. This is just the sort of latest version of that, but maybe one of the most vivid. But it's not just privacy institutions. A lot of what we worry about with deepfakes is the ability to engage critical thinking faculties about what is truth and what is not, right? And what do we value? What are the institutions we value? And a lot of this could be a deficit in some sort of education, some kind of digital literacy, some kind of broad civic participation. One of the reasons that we talked about already today that deepfakes present such a problem is because institutions of journalism have been changing dramatically and not always for the better. We have funding problems. We have differences in the way in which journalism is conducted and funded and who is trusted, and the media ecosystem looks vastly different and maybe not great in the way because it's so dispersed. And so maybe some of the problem has to do with the fact that we don't have as powerful gatekeepers as we previously did, and deepfakes preys upon that. One of the reasons we care is because of civic participation, because we've already talked about the sort of nightmare scenario whereby the night before an election, a deepfake video is released and it alters the outcome of an election. But of course, this might be less of a problem if we didn't concentrate all of our energy on one single day to vote, right? So there have been possible ways in which we make the voting process better, and perhaps the problem is not necessarily deepfakes, but this larger problem of civic participation and concentration in a particular day. And so it struck me that there were a lot of different problems, not just one that we could say is the deepfake problem. And so with that being said, the argument that we want to make is that there is an upside here where we can leverage this. We could seek deep structural reforms that have already been percolating in many different areas, and we can leverage the concept of deepfakes to maybe get us a little closer to that sort of reform. And because this is a privacy panel, I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking about possible privacy reforms, and then I'm going to hand it over to Jessica to talk about maybe some other ways in which we could effectuate some deep structural reforms to inoculate us across the board from the problem of deepfakes. The thing that I am encouraged by, given the visceral nature of deepfakes, the fact that we're having this symposium, the fact that every time I log on to the internet there is a new article talking about, holy crap, deepfakes are terrifying, is we might finally be able to make some pushes to have lawmakers take the design of information technology seriously. And we can do that in several different ways, which I'll talk about. There's another part of privacy law that has needed to be expanded for quite some time, and that's the law of relationships. So Ari has written at length about trust. I have written about the concept of trust with Neil Richards. There are a number of scholars that have explored this idea, but the law so far treats it as relatively cabined. The idea of a trusting relationship often sort of it comes down to the idea that you will not breach someone's confidentiality, right? I told you a secret and you will not share that secret with someone else. But of course, deepfakes doesn't necessarily involve the use of secrets. And the law of defamation is where we typically package that, but it's possible that we could expand the law of privacy within relationships to be more than just confidentiality, to be trust-based, to have obligations of loyalty within relationships, because a lot of the deepfake problems that we've talked about, not all, obviously. But a lot of the problems that we talk about are relational, right? The harm is actually some sort of breach of trust, a breach of loyalty. And perhaps if the law were to take that more seriously, that would enable several different possible legal remedies, not just a remedy against the actor who leaked it, but also embedded in the notion of the law of relationships are prohibitions on inducements to breach confidentiality or inducements to breach trust. Then we start getting into third-party actors that get into wrongful conduct because they are encouraging others to post harmful things. Right? And this is an established concept in various pockets and one that we could build out here. And then the other one is the law of design. And when I say the law of design, I mean more than just modifying 230. Which is an important concept, and one that I'm sure that we will talk about more in the platform section and throughout the day. But when I say talking about taking design seriously, I mean exploring some of the existing legal theories that might apply but simply need to be emboldened. And what do I mean by that? The Federal Trade Commission has for years been developing a means and instrumentalities theory. Meaning that if you create some sort of technology that provides the means and instrumentalities of a harm, then that is a harm in and of itself. Now, it's tricky because it's difficult to take a general purpose technology and call it a means and instrumentalities. But there is this theory, and this is from the Q-Checks case, which was a piece of software that basically enabled check fraud. And the FTC brought a complaint against the maker of the software and said, you are providing the means and instrumentalities of mass fraud. And it's possible that we could the Federal Trade Commission could embolden their jurisprudence a little to build this up more to combat deepfakes for those that create technologies explicitly designed to perpetuate some sorts of harms. What that is remains to be seen, but we could get into that. The second is spyware. Danielle, who always seems to have written about the things that are important 10 years before everyone else finally gets around to it, it has written about possibly banning spyware. We could take a similar sort of approach to trafficking, right, into sort of categorizing things. And then impact assessments, procedural protections, which we could impose upon companies to sort of engage in deepfake protections as part of the rollout of a program. And so those are just a few more we could add on abusive trade practices. But now I want to turn it over to broaden this, not just privacy.
So it's a great honor to be working with Woody on this. What I want to spend just maybe 7 minutes following up on is what it would mean to think about an upside to the deep fakes in terms of what talkback would look like, or my 14-year-old would say back talk. And I think what this has to do with is back talk is not always effective. And so the question will be is how do we make it more effective? What are the tools that exist already to actually accentuate the opportunities for back talk? One of the benefits of thinking about talking back to deep fakes institutionally, building our institutions to help us to talk back to it, is that I think we already have a lot of the tools already embedded in our society today and in our institutions. And what we learn from talking back is actually it doesn't really matter whether it's true or false. That is, it's a fake or it's a not fake. Really what happens is we have to think about what is being said. So it's a matter of interpreting and reinterpreting the story. So another way of thinking about this is that the context, one of the harms of deepfake is that we lose all context, and context is essential to interpreting the story that's being told. And so one of the things we have to learn how to do is ask questions about situation and recontextualization and re-narrativization. So I'm a humanities scholar as well as a law professor, so these words come from the ways we think about how to tell new stories with the same facts. And we're always asking about the situation of the story being told. And so deepfakes lose their context. One of the things we have to do is figure out how to put context back into it. And this is actually, with regard to privacy, this is about boundary claiming. This is about reinstantiating boundaries to the stories, and all stories are only meaningful because of the boundaries that contain them. And it's about identity management. So we already think about responsibility for interpreting the stories that circulate in our society. We are naturally storytellers, and we are naturally consumers of stories. And so I think, actually, we think all the time about the consumptive and capitalist nature of the stories that circulate. And I'm going to talk a little bit about those, about their purposes to either uplift or to denigrate us as people. That's what stories do, to dominate us or to liberate us. And that we think a lot already, like who's telling the story? Who's the authority of the speaker? And about the distance between the person telling, the receiver of the story, and how it goes down the chain, the game of telephone. We already have these critical skills embedded in us as audience members. So I'm just going to give you then some examples of how we already do some of these things, and we have done them for a very long time. And one of the things we might think about is how to buttress these skills that we already have. So, for example, propaganda films. There's been a whole history, and since film has been made and circulated, about audiences questioning and challenging the stories told through authority and power. This is Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will, glorifying the Third Reich. This was one of the most powerful documentaries in the 20th century, and the minute it started circulating, we were criticizing it as propaganda. Okay, how does that happen? How do film audiences become film critics? We do it today with mockumentaries, documentaries. We are film critics when we go to the film. And so what enables that kind of critical perspective that we lose when we go on the internet? What is that about? Why are we losing that? And of course, we do it with based on a true story films too. We ask questions like, how much was it based on? What facts were altered? Is this person look like the real person? And when we go to these films, we ask these questions. So why are we not asking those questions regularly when we see videos online? And why can't we? We can ask those questions. Advertising today, whether it's for laundry detergent, for example, or Weight Watchers, so for sure these stories that advertisers tell us are objectifying, and they are stereotyping, and they confine us. But what we learn from psychologists and sociologists is that actually we're getting very, very good at being skeptical about the stories that advertising tells us. And that these stories that we learn in these viral ads are actually, they're constitutive of sexuality and identity and gender, for example, and race, but they also produce critical subjects in us as consumers. So we've begun to be pretty good at certain forms of talkback when it comes to cultural production of stories. And what we learn to do is to counter-narrate, to be oppositional audiences, and we denaturalize some of the stories that are being told through those dominant narratives. We already do that in certain genres of popular culture already. So I don't want to suggest that I'm sort of a relativist, that anybody can tell whatever story you want. I'm not a relativist when it comes to cultural narratives or facts, but I'm a realist, and I think what we can learn from the humanities and from law, frankly, is that how stories work to sustain and undermine power is really what we're talking about when we're talking about deep fakes. And that's the way they function, and we should just get used to bringing that critical capacity to the videos we see online. We need to learn how to have a narrative upper hand. That's another way of thinking about it. So let me give you an example from the pre-deepfake world where this happened, and not necessarily to good outcome, but I believe in historicizing these things. So for those in the room who might remember the Rodney King video from 1991, it went viral in 1991 conditions, whatever that might be, but it did. And this told the story, for most of us, it told the story, this video, of a black man being beaten up by LA police officers, and it was a story of the unjustified use of force in the context of white supremacy. That's what it was to many of us. But at trial, the defense attorneys for the police officers turned it into a different story with the exact same video. What those defense attorneys did is they slowed it down, they re-narrativized it, and they told a story about the difficulty of policing in high-crime neighborhoods. And by slowing it down, they told a different story about causality. By re-narrativizing it, they gave it a different narrative authority. And all of a sudden, this film had two different stories that it told. And it had a new frame and a new context, and it worked in the court of law. Now, that wasn't a fake, but it was But it was a way of talking back that was very effective. And one of the things that's very frustrating as someone who thinks about these kind of things is why the people I don't like are always better at it. In like that is, how did the defense attorney figure out how to re-narrativize film, but the prosecutor didn't think that the film was actually going to be able to be re-narrativized. Like the weaknesses of not understanding that that's how film works actually undermine the case. Okay, so one of it, just to think more about, this is really about what stories are available to tell. The video doesn't speak for itself. The deep fake doesn't speak for itself. There are available stories that are embedded in these stories on a regular basis that you have to understand they're low-hanging fruit. And they're generally about power shifting. Why are deep fakes always about sex, for example, or power? You know, these are stories that are now going to be, they're the highly contested stories of our day, and it's about competing narratives about gender dominance, about patriarchy, about capitalism. And so when the stories are now being contested, it means that there are weaknesses in the dominant story that's being told, and I think we should take advantage of that. So what do we do about this? So media education. So I'm a big fan of thinking that this is about when rapidly changing technology, we need to put the technology in the hands of children, and they need to know how it works. So this is not about kids just learning more arts and civics and drama or whatever. This is about kids making their own videos. This is about college students learning how to talk back with video. This is about how, for them, they are going to understand that the medium and the message are entirely connected, and that means that the internet is not going to be a scary thing for them, that deepfakes might be annoying, they might even be amusing, but their curious and skeptical and productive use of technology as themselves being people who make these videos to tell stories, I think is going to disarm the ability of deepfakes to disrupt. I believe deeply in media education for our children. I also think this is about, so we have to reboot media education and cultural literacy. One of the way of thinking about this is that social media is not an entertainment, it's a science, and we have to start treating it that way. Woody has already talked about electoral reform. I won't go farther that, but I'll just say, what does this have to do with talking back? I think that we are actually more angry, when we are more angry and fearful and distrust our self-government and electoral institutions, our critical thinking skills deeply diminish. And so diminished, I think the more we believe in our systems of government and think the elections that we participate in are actually representative of preferences of the community, deepfake's ability to disarm will reduce. This is another way of thinking about authentication. That is, what all this is about is authentication, is that it is a social process. It's not about truth or not truth necessarily, but it's about the processes of authentication are sustained by our institutions, and we need to think more about how those institutions need to be more resilient today. And I will stop there.
I take Ari's presentation minimalism so seriously that I have no slides. I like that this authentication slide is just going to be behind my head this entire time. It's not, no. I thought I was going to be authenticated this entire presentation, but I won't. So I wanted to actually pick up, I'm glad that I went last, not least because I'm the least prepared, but also because it gives me a chance to reflect on some of the things that have been brought up so far. And really there's two things about just the last two presentations that I want to talk about and then circle back to something that Ari said. So one is this very evocative phrase that Woody used to say that deep fakes are a privacy train wreck. That's one sentiment. And then also this idea of talking back to a deep fake. And I actually think that the most interesting thing about deep fakes is that it is forcing us to confront the inadequacy of at least two doctrines, and that's both privacy and free speech. And so I think it's nicely encapsulated to try to capture this way to think, okay, is it a privacy train wreck, and in what sense are deepfakes a privacy train wreck? Because it very much depends on how we're classifying privacy, right? We have to figure out what we mean by that concept and how it's being emptied out or if it's being distilled in some way. And if that's the case, right, we think about this oftentimes opposition that we're told between privacy on the one hand and free speech on the other. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that we tend to think of privacy as, let's say, truthful information that I want to keep quiet, whereas free speech moves us in this direction of saying you can't keep anything quiet because everything has to be out there, right? So if you have this kind of, these competing ideas, privacy is about truth, free speech is about having to speak. If you push on either one of those concepts and you say, well, privacy is not just about the truth question, but there's also some more complicated, messy idea, maybe of autonomy, maybe of self-control, maybe of some sense of I have control over the way I want to be perceived, then actually that runs right into freedom of expression, right? Because there's no way to have a thick sense of autonomy and a way to develop your own personality if you are in some ways concerned about being surveilled, if you're worried about the fact that in the deepfake context, the source material, right, for the deepfake is your life. The more you are social, the more you've trusted someone, the more that you put yourself out there, maybe as Ari would say, the more likely it is that something like this will happen to you. And in other words, taking away from you the ability to speak when you want, or the ability not to speak, right? Or the ability not to be seen as speaking when you're not speaking. Right? So what I think is really, really interesting about this conversation that Danielle has really started for us is how can we think about deepfakes as a way of confronting the inadequacies of our legal doctrines when it comes to privacy and when it comes to freedom of speech. Now, I see this a lot, and the work that I do, as Danielle mentioned before, is in the realm, and she and I have worked on this issue called revenge porn, which many of you probably now heard of. And the word that we tend to use at the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative for revenge porn is non-consensual pornography. And we use that partly because we don't think it's actually accurate to describe it as revenge, that's part of it. But we do maintain the pornographic part because we really do want to capture that graphic, sexually explicit nature of this material. Now, I mention this because in the conversation over deepfakes, when everybody got alarmed about this, especially over the pornographic deepfakes, the question was, is this non-consensual pornography? And people asked that question not just in the definitional sense, but also, should it be treated like non-consensual pornography, legally speaking, or according to the way that the social media platforms are starting to treat non-consensual pornography? And we've made some progress on that front. We've got 42 states now that have laws against non-consensual pornography. So it's a pretty obvious question to say, well, is it like that? Have we handled it, right? Can we take the same statute that we've got for revenge porn and use it for deepfakes? And this I find to be a really interesting question, because that completely turns on how you define non-consensual pornography. In one very general sense, you could say a deepfake is exactly non-consensual pornography. You are not consenting to be made into this pornographic object, and yet you have been. And so in that sense, they are in fact identical. But here's the tricky thing. As a matter of doctrine, it was very important for those of us at the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative to put forward the idea of the revenge porn statute as a privacy issue. Right? Privacy as in, this is truthful information, a real photo of you or a video of you that you did not in fact disclose to the public. And so the analogy here is going to be things like laws that protect against the information being disclosed from your driver's license or your social security number. And that was not only what we thought was accurate about describing what is wrong with non-consensual pornography, but it's also going to explain why it is that it is not an infringement upon people's freedom of speech, unless you think all privacy law is basically an infringement upon people's freedom of speech, that you actually think that we should be able to tell everybody's medical records, put them all online, or that we should be able to see everybody's credit card information. Now that, I think we're pretty happy about, except to the extent that most of those 42 states did not take our advice, and so we've ended up with a real mess of actual laws that do mess with this concept of either privacy versus representation versus something else, or harassment, which is even worse. That's a problem. But if we're trying to be honest about the conceptual nature of non-consensual pornography as we see it, it's got to be truthful information that is wrongfully disclosed. That puts us in a real difficult position when it comes to deepfakes, because the entire definition of a deepfake is that it's not truthful information. So it would seem as though it would be exactly the wrong statute to use, the wrong legislative response to say, let's try to make those two things go together. But that's tricky, right? Because the victims that come to our organization and describe what's happened to them, it is really hard to tell the difference between someone who has been victimized by an actual photo that was distributed without their consent and someone who has had the experience of having it being faked. The sense of trauma, the same sense of exposure, the same sense of not wanting to be seen, of worrying what people are going to see when they look at you. It's really hard to distinguish the two. So there's something kind of heartbreaking about saying, no, this is not for you, this is not what's going to cover that particular harm that you've suffered. So I think that's one thing we have to be careful about. And the more that we slip into the idea of making these statutes cover things like false information, we're going to be confronting, and I know the next panel is probably going to talk about this more, questions of the First Amendment and how much creative expression rights go into the creation of a deepfake itself. But there's where it gets interesting, right? So if we think, for instance, about why it is, and I'm speaking very oversimplistically about this, but if we have, as a general matter, in our freedom of speech doctrine, treated lies or false statement with some kind of deference or wanted to give them breathing room, I'd like to say that's because we had two major assumptions that we basically shouldn't even be countenancing anymore. The first one is, and I'm thinking about New York Times versus Sullivan on the one hand and Hustler v. Falwell on the other, two very fun cases. And what you have there in New York Times versus Sullivan is the idea that you could be inaccurate about somebody, factually inaccurate about somebody in a completely believable way, but that should not be punished. You shouldn't bring the hammer down on somebody like that, especially if the subject being talked about is a public official, because mistakes are going to get made. So you need to leave breathing room for this, right? So the public official is able to speak back. We would like to believe that someone who's got that kind of power and influence can speak back. That's one. And you also don't want to punish that kind of false statement unless the person who's making the statement is really being quite intentional about saying, I know this is false and I want it to be out there anyway, or I'm reckless with regard to whether or not it is false. That's on the one side. Then you've got Hustler v. Falwell, which if you haven't read it, you definitely should, and you should definitely check out the actual Campari ad. That would have been a good slide, but I am not good at presentations. So the Campari ad is a fake ad in Hustler magazine. So apparently back in the 1970s or 80s, Campari used to have these My First Time ads, and they're meant to be double entendres, very clever, about the first time they ever had Campari, but it's also clearly meant to be written as an anecdote about a person's first sexual experience. Now, Larry Flynt and Jerry Falwell had gotten into some sort of tiff. I expect it was about pornography. And they decided at one point to run a kind of fake Campari ad that targeted Jerry Falwell. And the story that they told about his first time was with his mother in an outhouse. And I think a chicken was involved. This is interesting. Now, the ad itself, if you see it, there's no picture there, except there's actually this really sort of dignified photo of Jerry Falwell himself. It's just taken from, one of his profiles or what have you. And then there's just all this text of him having sex with his mother, and there's a chicken involved. And so this is interesting because the court then says this is also okay. Now, the reason why they say it's okay is not because they think that this isn't offensive in some ways, but they say, okay, first of all, Jerry Falwell is a public figure. He's not a public official, but public figures, too, have this power to speak back. So we're back to that idea that you can correct the record. But much more interestingly, they dealt with this question of malice, which we got from New York Times versus Sullivan, and they don't say, they try to say something like, well, here there's no real malice because it wasn't done intentionally with regard to the truth or falsity of the statement. But that's weird, right? Because of course it was, because they didn't actually think, nobody actually thought that he had sex with his mother in an outhouse. What the court actually kind of hints at is that's what they find to be less troubling about the speech. Nobody would have read this ad and thought it was true. In other words, there's a lack of believability. So if you want to take it this way, it's New York Times versus Sullivan says, we're going to protect speech that is false and believable without malice. But Hustler v. Falwell says, we're also going to protect speech if there's malice, but it's totally unbelievable. Now, I think that that's interesting. We do need to rethink that in our current climate because, of course, there's a question about counter speech, the idea that you can actually talk back at all, right? And then there's also this question of believability. Now, the believability stuff is completely different. Now, we really do have to rethink everything we've thought before when it comes to parody ads and the like. It wasn't the case before that you could actually create something that would make somebody believe this was a realistic representation. So we have to revisit our doctrine in light of that. But we also have to revisit this idea of counter speech. Because non-consensual pornography, whether we mean it in the deepfake sense or not, is, I think, one of those kinds of speech that actually should be classified as unanswerable speech. And unanswerable speech includes things like naked photos of you, but it also includes things like your home address or where your kids go to school when somebody's trying to dox you. There's really no way to speak back to that and to say, I'm going to correct the record, I'm going to post a picture of myself with clothes on. There's no way to actually try to have a counter-speech discussion there, which means that there's an inadequacy of that free speech idea. So if we're looking at those concepts, we really have to rethink that, and we have to rethink what is the among other harms of a representation that is false or a truthful representation that is privacy invading, what is the hedonic loss in addition to any other kinds of injuries, right? What is lost there is not something you can get back. You cannot get back if, for instance, in the actual photo context, a particular moment that may have been incredibly intimate and private and joyous becomes something very different, and you can never get back what it was before, right? And if you see yourself in a deep fake video, right, in a pornographic setting, you can never get that sense of yourself back, even if tomorrow maybe it gets pulled from social media and you don't have to see it all the time. So I think we really do have to grapple with this idea of unanswerable speech, and we can't keep insisting that there is this tension between, oh, privacy over there and the right to speak on the other hand, because it's simply inadequate. So those are things that I think are moving us in an interesting direction analytically. Now I want to get back to something that I think is implicit, or actually it's quite explicit in the last presentation, which is the good story here. And there is something like a good story. Here's a side note about the deep fake thing that's really interesting for revenge porn. The thing is, if the real harm for a lot of victims of revenge porn was, you've seen me in a context that's intimate and I can never get that back, right? You've seen me in a way and I'm totally exposed. The really tiny upside, tiny silver lining of deepfakes, right, for truth decay is now it's always going to be at least somewhat of a possibility in everyone's mind that it's not really you, right? That revenge porn video may just be faked after all. So there's a kind of beneficial ambiguation here that's not the liar's dividend, and it's actually a virtuous dividend here to be able to make it so we'll never know if anybody's sex video is actually a sex video. And the other side of it is something that I think Woody was pointing out before, which is there's an empathy kind of moment here. People are worried about this because it could happen to them. So I can't tell you how many times in the revenge porn context we hear back from people saying, yeah, well, these women, and it's usually women, should not have sent these pictures or they shouldn't have taken these photos. That's the kind of thing you get if you engage in this type of behavior. Fascinating thing about the deepfake is it could happen to you. Now, is that a good thing, right? I think the positive side of this is yes, this is, I think the last time I was here, we were talking about democratic surveillance, and my entire sort of thesis was when middle-class white people's privacy gets invaded, we should all applaud because now something is going to happen, right? So that is something I would repeat here. I think that is true. I think this is right about the impulse to say we have a moment for structural change. Here's what I'm concerned about, and this is back to Ari's point. Ari's entire presentation, I think, was focused on a distributional consequence, right? People are not going to bear the burdens of deepfakes equally. The fact that we might believe certain things about certain people, or we would dismiss certain things about certain people, or we'd be able to use a deepfake to our advantage. When people say things like, oh, Donald Trump doing this or this or this, first of all, whoever knows what Donald Trump actually is doing, so we're never going to be able to tell what's fake or real with him, unless maybe he's using complete sentences or something like that, and then we could all spot it. But think about what would happen, that it wouldn't be a question of I get to say it's fake or this is real. It would be more that someone like him, let's just think of a politician like him, would be able to say it's true to the base that it plays to and not true to the base that it doesn't play to. We would be in a situation of radical dishonesty, right? Nothing matters. All that matters is the thing that your crowd wants to hear. That, I think, is a frightening prospect. So I guess for the conclusion of this, I'm thinking I would be much more comforted, and I think I would be much more in line with the last presentation if I thought that what was going to happen going forward was we were going to look to the bottom, as Mari Matsuda would say. If we're actually going to look at those kinds of experiences of people who have been vulnerable all this time, and whose privacy and whose freedom of expression rights have always been the ones that get unequally burdened, have always been complicated in some ways, and we would learn from that. Some of you may know from the human rights context this concept called the last girl. The last girl concept is modified from Gandhi, and it says that when you are thinking about a policy or a change or some kind of revolution, you have to ask yourself, how would this affect the last girl? And the last girl is supposed to be the most vulnerable, the most oppressed, the most exploited. If I thought that the deep fake crisis was going to bring us to a moment where we would decide that we would restructure freedom of speech and privacy around the last girl, I would have some confidence. But at the moment, I am less confident, and I think I will stop there.
So Suzie, do you want to respond to some of this or ask questions? You know, this is, what do they say? We have moderators' prerogative here, which is always fun.
I'd love to ask some questions. We've got
Great,
such great minds here.
Yeah.
I've been thinking a lot about this concept of how there might be some sort of unique harm with deepfakes and with privacy invasions as this. And the one thing I'm really interested in is, do we need some sort of novel remedies as well? So the remedies that we have right now is we have criminalization, But often with deepfakes, in the same way with revenge porn, we often have relationships where we might not want to criminalize a person, or you have these civil remedies where you get some sort of financial award. But often when you're thinking about deepfakes and revenge porns and these types of violations, often you need an immediate response. And so do you think that there's some sort of particular remedy that we need, that the law needs to come up with to respond to privacy invasions like deepfakes?
You're looking at me, so
I'm looking at you.
So I would like to hear what Danielle has to say about this too, because I think before you'd said very, very, I think emphatically, well, we can't just ban deepfakes. You know what I'm going to say? Yeah, we can. We totally can, and that might be the only solution because this is
why
the
we're a
real.
good pair, Marianne, right?
This is the real challenge, right? Is because when we're dealing with unanswerable speech, everything about the law presumes that you can do something after the fact, right? Sometimes that's just not the case, and we know this is true not just in these contexts, but also things like sexual assault or domestic violence. You can't make a person whole after these things. So what is the law's role at that point? It's to be a massive deterrent. So I think at that point you have justification at least to say, yeah, you can outlaw it, and you can say there are going to be crazy penalties that are attached to this, right? And therefore you shouldn't do it because we're going to have to shift those incentives in some way. So much of what we're talking about now is deeply embedded in technology and social media. Now, what does that mean? It means no impulse control. It means no speed bumps between the thing that pops into my head to do and me doing it, right? So what you need is some kind of, really, I hate to say this for all sorts of reasons, but you need some sort of extremely viscerally punitive idea, right, to stop you from doing something like this. Or you need an actual structural block. I think this is something that Woody talked about many years ago about automation and privacy designs and things of that nature. There are some things that you can actually just block out, like if you would actually put the club on your steering wheel so that your car can't be stolen. If there was a way to do that, to brick the system so that you can't actually submit a deepfake. So I was thinking, for instance, you have a really clever hacker who just makes every deepfake automatically trigger a virus, so that every time you disclose, a deepfake, you get a virus. That would be amazing. So it's either that or put everybody in jail. I'm sorry, that's all I got.
Anyone else?
Yeah.
As is always the case, I 100% agree with literally everything Marianne says. I have nothing to add.
Do we need innovation in law? Do we have the tools already? Could there somehow be a legal mandate for education that would protect the last girl, right? The most vulnerable?
I think this is a cultural. I think this is a cultural problem, and I, as much as I love being a lawyer and a law professor and believe in the rule of law, I don't think the law will solve this problem. I think this is a story about how power disseminates through narratives in a new medium of technology, and this is, law might help move it in a certain direction to diminish certain particular harms, maybe, but law never makes us whole, ever. So I don't think there's a strong legal solution to this.
I think that actually highlights the inadequacy of seeing deepfakes as having any upside, and also the unequal burden bearing, the ways in which people are not going to bear the burdens of deepfakes equally. Because if we say that the one thing that we have to do, which in a perfect world, you're absolutely right that we need better media literacy and more critical ability to interrogate these things, that A, takes time, and B, those are not capacities that all consumers of deepfake videos will ever be able to have. So maybe that sounds terrible to say that, but in seeing upsides to these videos, really not really upsides. What you're really saying is that there are silver linings because it highlights how how messed up we are. So it's a silver lining because it highlights, almost like the Trump administration. There's a silver lining to this train wreck because it organized us and it highlights and it created more progressive energy and all of that. But I think the ability to re-narrate and to critically assess deepfake videos is a uniquely elite characteristic or uniquely elite capacity that there are going to be people, if we train them, who are going to be able to interrogate the validity of these videos and who are going to be able to interrogate the social implications of spreading them. But since there are lots of people who won't be able to, and also because there's going to be a whole segment of the population that's going to believe them no matter what, like the political-oriented videos. Like there was a whole segment of the population that thought that Leni Riefenstahl's movie was the most amazing thing ever. And in a world that we exist in today, that you're going to, as Marianne said, you're going to give that information to your base and some other information to the other people. And then given that we don't all have the ability to interrogate these videos, then that's just a further erosion of democratic norms and our ability to function together. So I don't see how the upside is or the silver lining is actually a silver lining, because while it may highlight the need for reform, it actually highlights how terrible things are and the inability of law to do anything about it, to do something significantly about it, and the inability of extra-legal solutions to handle it with any equality, because people are going to bear the burdens of these deepfake videos when given that most people don't have the ability to adequately interrogate them for what they are.
So I just want to go back to a thought so Marianne, it's like 2013, I think, and we had this conversation about why don't we this was your idea. I think it's spot on, but I want to push both of us, right? You said, listen, with sexually explicit photographs, the presumption, the default, should be non-consent, which can be toggle back to consent, right? But we need proof of that, right? And that works. I have to say, the more, as in everything Marianne says, the more you think about it, you think that's exactly right, right, over time. And I guess the only interrogation for us, like as we journey and think about that default, no consent, and unless you explicitly say so, right? Something my OBGYN sister said the other day, that we should have on all emails, it should be, this is not to be shared with anyone else that she has for all of her patients. I had her read Sexual Privacy, and that was her response. I said, Marianne said that years ago. What about, though, and this is the upside conversation we're having, when it's parody and satire and art, do you know what I'm saying? Like where you can't get consent because the point is non-consent, right? So I'm so convinced the default is no, except yes. And then how do we apply that in a world in which, does that make sense, Marianne? So if it's okay to ask, because you've had me stimulated and thinking about this now for a long time, how do we then toggle off, just get out of that frame when art and politics and satire come into play?
Yeah, thanks so much for asking that, because the first part, I do want to say, maybe bears a little bit of elaboration. So part of the conversation we were having, because we were trying to think about how do you conceptualize the revenge porn problem? And one of the things we were thinking about was, well, why isn't it, or in some ways it does so parallel the sexual assault conversation, right? So the panic of a few years ago when people said, oh my God, there's this concept called affirmative consent, it's gonna ruin, everybody's a rapist now. And the radical idea of affirmative consent was that you should not presume that people wanna have sex with you until they indicate that they wanna have sex with you. And that's really all there is to it, right? And it seemed to shock people, which in itself was a little bit revealing and kind of disturbing. But, so there's that. There's like, it shocked. You say that, but when I was teaching this in my sub-crim class, actually, there was a woman a female student who raised her hand and said, well, if that were the rule, then everybody would have been raped by now. And I thought, this is the saddest thing. And she wasn't saying that in a critical way. She just thought, that's why that can't possibly be true. So that's very disturbing. Now, so this is interesting, right? So, fast forward to 2018, Facebook, Cambridge Analytica, suddenly people are like, oh, wait, when I agree to let Facebook, see my friends list, or I take one of those quizzes to find out if I'm a Rachel, I wasn't actually giving over. I didn't think that I was giving this information so that, the election could be interfered with. And so people really get it intuitively, right? Oh, wait, my consent in this one context was not transferable to other contexts, and people got really upset at the idea that you wouldn't know that, right? And you can also see some parallel things and progressive critiques of the Fourth Amendment, right? That you should not presume, like if you stop somebody and you say, can I search your car, and you don't tell them they can say no, is that a voluntary consensual search? So we should be having this consent. You and I have been trying to work on this for some time. time. We need to be having that conversation. But that's not what you asked me. So this question about parody and satire, I do think that one too easy answer is to say, well, the problem with deepfakes is the indistinguishable from a realistic idea. That's the problem, right? Because satire and parody, the whole reason why they have that frisson is because you know that it's not the real thing. If you think it is the real thing, it's not a parody anymore. So I think that that's the way that you distinguish. You say you have to make it clear that I am making fun of something or I am repurposing something, but you cannot impersonate, right?
That
You
is
cannot
not
fully
always
appropriate.
true about parody in art. It is not always true that your first experience of it is that, oh, this is a joke.
Well, not your
Sometimes
first experience.
the overwhelming experience of the art is that you thought it was real, and then all of a sudden you realize it's not.
But there is at some point some recognition that this is not in fact real. I think without that, it's not a parody. Until that moment of
Right,
recognition,
but
I'm
the
not
question,
sure that we
where does
have-
that come from? Where does that realization of unreality come from? It doesn't necessarily come from a label at the bottom of the screen or in the museum or whatever. It could come from your experience over and over and over again about what art or what story or what these particular installations look like. I mean, part of it is we don't actually, as a culture, have an experience of the deepfake phenomenon long enough to be able to understand like how it acts on us and circulates and are made. I mean, one of the things I find so funny about this, I mean, not funny, awful, about this conversation is, we circulate false stories all the time as people. I mean, lies are part of our social structure. And I actually think we're very well equipped to tell lies and to interpret lies. I think what we need to figure out is whether there's something, and this is what Suzie, you asked before, is there something very unique about this kind of storytelling on the internet that makes it different from all the other kind of lies? And I'm not sure about that. One of the things that you mentioned before, though, Marianne, is that I think there is more and more realization that there is, like, we all have a common stake in the internet. Like, it is much more of an equalizer than film and advertising or what. I mean, it is much less centralized. And so I think the more and more that is experienced, I think there may actually be more pushback on what kind of stories we permit ourselves to tell. But that may be different. The common stake we have in the internet may be a different differentiating feature. But I don't think it's the lies or humans have been doing that forever. And hurting people with them.
Suzie,
whatever.
can I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry to take the moderator's role, but I want to follow up on this particular point. So I'm sympathetic to Marianne's view here, but it seems to me that in this discussion, the barrier that some people might have to taking a radical view that's saying we should just criminalize it or ban it or deal with it in some radical way would be that what about parody or what about satire? That there is some free speech. That there's some free speech out there that could use there's speech out there that could use deepfakes in some valuable way. If I'm incorrect on that, then please correct me. But it strikes me that if I'm thinking about psychological studies with respect to how people internalize or process parody, and Jessica, you've done work on this, so I'd be interested in your thoughts. How people psychologically process parody and satire, and the differences between what we commonly in common discourse understand as satire or parody. Like, think about a cold open at Saturday Night Live. Sometimes they're completely not funny. So it's not humor that distinguishes parody from real life. It is, but Marianne, I think, is right, is that parody gets, and this is how the law responds to it, parody gets kind of leeway in fair use because you have to take enough of it so people realize that it is a parody of some other thing. So they allow you to take more despite fair use's restrictions on taking a lot of stuff from from something that's copyrighted. So if that's the case, then it's the elements of it that are distinguished from what you've taken, which the First and the Seventh and the Fifth Circuit have talked about when they talk about fair use, that make it the parody. It's the fact that the stuff that you've added to it create that commentary. In the deepfake world, there's nothing to the common eye that is distinguishing from the stuff that you're taking. So then why is it that parody is in the way, the need for allowing this technology for the use in parody and satire is in the way of us from completely banning deep fakes at all? What have I missed here?
I don't think about it in terms of only parody, first of all, and I'm not against criminalizing and banning. I can imagine all different ways that would work. So I reject the idea that we are not capable of reading into these things more agency than is being described, first of all. But also, I also think about political speech. I think about, it's not only parody and satire, it's also revolutionary and political speech, some of which, there are a lot of unintended consequences for total bans on speech that we think we can identify generically, like as a genre. We think that's the deep fake, we're going to ban it. And the idea is like, why do we think we can identify it? Like, what about that? I mean, it presupposes a category of speech that is containable, and I think that the fact is that it's not. And so I think we have to interrogate that. And the fact that it's not containable, I think, suggests that there's opportunities to turn it around. Now, I agree that I don't think it's elitist at all. I actually think young people today actually talk back to technology very, very effectively, and I think that I actually have a lot of hope for that. And I actually think we do it instinctively. We just don't do it with certain genres. We become unable to talk back when it comes to certain things because of who's being talked to, because it's about gender oppression or racial oppression, for example. But I think that there's a history of that kind of talking back, and I worry that actually if we ban certain forms of speech, the backtalk tool is going to be taken away.
I just want to say on that note, I think that I'm sympathetic to a lot of what you've just said. What I do want to emphasize, though, is that that's a conversation we tend to have all the time in the free speech context, is that however bad this thing is, banning it's always worse. And the only thing I want to push back on that is how much worse could it possibly get? It's not because I'm idealistic about what it looks like to criminalize things. And those of you who know my other work, to hear me say I'm pro-carceral state, it should be disturbing, right? Because it's racist and sexist junk. So I hate having to say, let's rely on the criminal justice system. This is the worst case scenario, right? But it has to be a question of, yes, there's unintended consequences to banning, but look at the intended consequences of doing nothing.
No,
and so
I
this is
totally
the problem that I think we have to face, which is that calculation cannot be some magical era in which we got it right and deepfakes don't exist. It's either this world or maybe a slightly too oppressive, too much chilled speech. That's probably right.
And also, just to reinforce what you're saying, to not do anything, to not ban, to not regulate is a value choice that we are picking winners versus losers. And we have to understand that we're doing that. And we can reject that. We can reject that. But I'm just, just for
No, absolutely.
engagement's sake, I'm pushing up against the categories that you're inserting.
How many minutes do we have, folks?
Oh, no, we have to let them ask questions.
No audience questions.
So let's ask, let's ask questions.
So
10 minutes of questions.
Absolutely, let's take, fabulous, we have questions. So, Alan, you want to go first, and then, yes.
Sure, so my question
I'm going to
is,
get you.
The Oprah mic.
Nobody's going to know what that is in like 10 years.
It's true. It's unfortunate. Unless there's a deep fake of it.
so my question is about deepfakes without disclosure. So I'm just curious, one can imagine situations in which a deepfake is created for someone's own personal consumption and is not disclosed. And I wonder if,
I need some tea, I'm so cold.
All right, so my question is about deepfakes without disclosure, right? So you can imagine a situation in which someone makes a deepfake for their own enjoyment, their own consumption, does not disclose that. And I wonder what the folks on this panel think about that situation, right? On the one hand, presumably traditionally you can make pornographic drawings or cartoons or limericks or whatever about anyone you want in the privacy of your own home, and we don't usually think of that as a privacy violation. At the same time, the idea that someone might have taken a picture of me and used it to create an image or video that is both false and that, for let's say, I also find incredibly offensive, raises its own issues. And so I'm just curious what you all think about that fact pattern.
I love that fact pattern, which is to say I hate it, and it gets much worse, right? So I wrote a piece recently about virtual reality where because think about these two things coming together, right? Highly realistic images of someone, now virtual reality, that is to say with haptic feedback and the whole thing, right? All of the sort of good sides, upsides that people give about virtual reality, if you hear what most of them are saying, it's that it makes you feel as though you're experiencing something, not looking at something. Now, depending on what we're talking about, that's either incredibly liberating or it's terrifying or both, right? So not only do we have to imagine that scenario, but we imagine that you're deep faked into a virtual reality system where you're being sexually assaulted or where you get to beat up a homeless man. So we really need to ask ourselves what's happening cognitively to those people so we can say, it seems like he's contained within your own home, right? So then we have all this case law that would say, well, stuff that you do in your own home, even stuff that would be illegal if you were to distribute it, is okay. But now if we know that there's some sort of connection between what you're going to be doing with that system and who you're going to be outside of it, that's very concerning. My first instinct is to say there's nothing the law can actually do about that, right? That's something we literally can't reach. We don't want to reach into people's homes and make that impossible to do, but we really have to be extremely worried about what this is actually going to do to people, especially if you really do imagine the very specific consequences, right? Terrible relationship, woman finally leaves an abusive marriage, and he's able to deep fake, virtual reality porn her like every single day. Like that's incredibly disturbing. Should we be able to criminalize maybe him telling her that he's doing that, for instance? Is that a kind of intentional infliction of emotional distress, right? So I think we definitely need to dwell on exactly those nightmare scenarios.
Although we do criminalize possession of child pornography, and this fact pattern does remind me of when the Supreme Court says that child pornography, bad, but fake child pornography when it's not actually children in the video, yeah, that's totally cool, and that's not
that's
totally.
Exactly what they said.
Yeah, right. That's not obviously from my opinion is that's not totally cool, but we do have precedent for criminalizing possession. Right. And the rationale the Supreme Court gave in not criminalizing the creation and the possession of fake child pornography was that it doesn't have the same effect on the child. That's a very myopic way of thinking about it. What about the effect on the people that are watching it, the effect on society of having that in existence? I have no problem. I have no problem reaching into that room, reaching into that house in order to address that problem. I think we do need to think about the transporting the approach that we have in child porn to the approach we have in deep fakes, but that's not so radical, because we do that for other things that are really bad, that have really bad effects on individuals who are in them, and also really bad on society.
Can I ask you a question about just on that specific point? So as far as I understand, in the Ashcroft case, that was virtual child pornography that was just completely computer generated. It was not the question of what if you took an actual child's face and made it seem as though they were part. Because I think now we've got the deep fake child porn question, like an actual child's identity, which just to, as a sort of a side note, the more I think about this question and have been dwelling on this ever since I read the paper, the more I think this is actually maybe best addressed through some kind of identity theft statute, right? This is really about impersonation in a kind of way that you make a gesture at, right? That I think, and I was looking at the federal identity theft statute to take a look at this, right? The production of false documentation. Because what is it that bothers us when people are using our identity? It's because they're out there looking like us and being perceived as us in a way that we can't shake. Right. Even if we think about the times if our credit card gets stolen and our credit gets bad, and you look at it and you see all the kinds of purchases they made, and you're like, oh my God, someone thinks that I made those kinds of purchases. There's some kind of, psychological loss there. But I really do worry, I wonder specifically about the child porn context of, would the Supreme Court feel the same way if it wasn't fully computer generated, but it was an actual child, one that lives in your neighborhood, and that you now have a deep fake child porn?
Yeah, so I think the deep fake version of Ashcroft would come out the same way, because the rationale of Ashcroft was that there's no child in being harmed because no child is actually participating in the pornography. So in the deepfake version of Ashcroft, there is a child, a real person, a real child being appropriated, but that child was never part of the pornography.
Would we worry about wouldn't we all worry in the audience about, well, how does that neighbor now see that child?
Oh, absolutely.
And I wonder if that would be enough to make the Supreme Court say, no, even if it's not an actual child being harmed, there's something about that, about the way we would worry about that particular person looking at that particular child. That would make
but that wasn't even enough for them in Ashcroft. So why would that be I mean, I have zero faith in the Supreme Court of doing anything good now, but like why would that be? I doubt that it would, that all of a sudden that they would think about that now, given that it's still not an actual trial. But I agree, it should have mattered back then.
Let's get some more questions.
I'm Ashish Jaman. This is the first time I'm in the midst of so many, lawyers and law professionals. I'm a technologist. So my question actually is around the banning of deepfakes. And I love the discussion there. Internet, as we know, is a global thing, right? It's a global technology. When we talk about banning, and creation of deepfakes is also a global phenomenon, right? When we talk about banning specifically, how are we thinking about it? Are we thinking actually banning the consumption of it, or are we thinking the production of it? Because production can happen anywhere. Or are we thinking about banning the delivery channels, right? So I don't know where, how do you go about this, right? Banning is a very broad term, but, as we start thinking about it, what are your thoughts?
Excellent. Excellent.
So the
I mean,
question, if
it-
it's just creation or distribution or, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, if you wanted to answer.
Talk about design.
Yeah, so I mean, there's several things you could target, and I think that it's each one comes with costs and perils. I mean, you could ban the content itself, right? You could ban either the sharing of it or the possession of it, which we have done in sort of other contexts. Or you could ban the creation devices, right? So if someone if there were technologies that were designed particularly to sense face prints, for example, right, or to graph face prints onto existing video, then you could ban the sort of creation tools, or you could ban the trafficking of those tools, right? So in spyware, we ban the trafficking of spyware, right, not just the use, or you could ban the use of it, right? And so there are several. Right.
Jurisdictional question.
Oh, jurisdictional questions. Oh, right.
I don't find those arguments very persuasive because we have jurisdictional problems for everything that could possibly go beyond our borders. So I mean, but we deal with it. If we want to restrict if we want to restrict a community's access to something that society deems as bad for that community, we have ways. Some of them are more draconian than others. We have examples in the world of very draconian uses of technology to simply cut off access to the internet for an entire country. So when someone says that the internet is global, you can't do anything about it, well, it's literally not true. We don't necessarily, taking those kind of draconian steps is not necessarily a good idea for a democracy, but we have been addressing the jurisdictional issues for some time, and we've allowed states to regulate, and we do that in the privacy world. Anyone who gathers any information on any California resident is subject to the upcoming California Consumer Privacy Act. I have no concern about figuring out the jurisdictional issues. I have concerns with people pushing back on our ability to regulate bad stuff on the internet by merely saying that the internet is global. The internet we have both technological, legal, and norm-based ways to cordon off access to certain things that we feel are bad for
But
society.
let me just say, you're a technologist, and you said you're not around lawyers all the time. So when we start thinking about jurisdictional solutions or problems, we're not thinking about perfect solutions. So technologists often think about, how do I get it down so that there's very, very little error here? In law, we don't think that way at all. There's always going to be error. There's always going to be leakiness. So we're just looking for the more perfect solution, but not the perfect one.
The right to be forgotten is part of this too. I mean, you can look at this and see, the ways in which, gatekeepers play a humongous role. If Apple decides to pull the app, then it's gone, right? And if YouTube decides not to host it, then it's largely invisible, right? So there's a lot of platform, which we'll talk about. We got a whole panel on platforms.
We have one final question.
Ari, this one's for you. You had mentioned, I believe, that it's extremely difficult to identify one of these videos.
Are you asking me?
Yes,
If they're good, they're hard to identify, right? It's the whole point of them.
but they can be identified with the correct.
No, Not always.
Not always, but
Not
there
always.
are some technologies that allow you to. Well, that's how we identified Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's video as fake. There are, so you can sometimes, but it's very difficult.
There are good forgers and bad forgers.
And also, but even where you can technically identify it, the fact that, as Jessica mentioned, that we're really good sharers of lies and of stuff, we tend to just share stuff. So in the space, in the decision-making space between access and sharing is way too quick for the average person to be able to identify if something is a lie or not.
Okay,
Thank you so much.
Always fun to be on the council. I love being on the council.
I'll put it up.